Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see, cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection, to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy, from the earliest moments, when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused, except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. And the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity. And the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated. And the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable. And the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation. And the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people. But the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection, and the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition. And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them, and the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed. And the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity, without this integration, is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. And the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self. And the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural, but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation. And the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available. And the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity. And identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated. And the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce. But the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices. And the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face. And the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition. And recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly. And the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual. And the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity, and identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation. And mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually. And visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, when external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal, and the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors, and mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back, and what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, and identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation, and mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable, and recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown, and the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had, and the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves. Because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection. Meaning was not invented but was given, was not constructed but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced, not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there. And the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option, and without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different, and what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm. And the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values. And so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen. And choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself rather than in any purpose that living serves. and the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible, and the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair, and the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity, the flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction, and conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story, and what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance, and the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning, and the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived, and the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not. Many cannot. Many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not. And the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Every culture sees itself as the center, as the normal, as the standard against which all others are measured. And this seeing is not perception, but is construction, is not discovery, but is projection, is the way that collective consciousness creates a mirror that reflects not what is there, but what needs to be there, what the culture needs to believe about itself in order to maintain coherence, to justify its existence, to explain why it is the way it is and why that way is right, is natural, is superior to the ways of others, and the superiority is not argued but is assumed, is the unexamined premise that underlies all cultural self-understanding, is the narcissism that is not individual but is collective, is the belief that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes about itself, is the myth that every nation tells, is the story that makes the culture cohere, that gives members a sense of belonging, of pride, of being part of something that matters. And the mattering is created through the mirror, through the reflection that shows not reality, but idealization. Not what is, but what is imagined. Not the truth, but the narrative. And the narrative is selective, is editing out what does not fit, is highlighting what confirms, is creating the image that the culture wants to see, needs to see, must see in order to function. And the functioning requires this distortion, requires this narcissism, because without it the culture would have to confront its ordinariness, its contingency, its lack of cosmic significance. And the lack is unbearable, is threatening to the collective sense of worth, is undermining the pride that holds the group together. And so the mirror is maintained, is polished, is defended against any reflection that might show something different, something less flattering, something true. And the truth is what the mirror hides, is what the distortion prevents, is what the narcissism protects against. Because the truth is that every culture is just one culture among many, is not special, is not chosen, is not superior, is just a particular arrangement of customs and beliefs and practices that happen to emerge in a particular place at a particular time. And that could have been otherwise. And the otherwise is what cannot be acknowledged, is what the mirror does not show, is what the myth denies, because acknowledging contingency is admitting that the culture is not necessary, is not inevitable, is not the fulfillment of destiny, but is just accident, just history, just the result of forces that have nothing to do with the culture's self-understanding. And the self-understanding is what the mirror creates, is what the myth provides, is the story that makes the culture make sense, that explains why things are the way they are, that justifies the structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities that characterize every culture. And the justification is necessary, is required, is what prevents revolution, what maintains order, what ensures that those who benefit from the arrangement continue to benefit, and those who suffer continue to accept their suffering as natural, as deserved, as the way things must be. And the must is the mythology, is the claim to necessity, is the insistence that this culture, this arrangement, this way of being is not just one way, but is the way, is the correct way, is the superior way. And the superiority is demonstrated through comparison, through the creation of the other, through the projection onto outsiders of everything that the culture rejects in itself, everything that threatens the idealized image, everything that the mirror cannot reflect without shattering. And the shattering is what must be prevented, is what the other makes possible by absorbing all the negativity, all the qualities that the culture denies having, all the characteristics that are incompatible with the myth. And the incompatible is projected outward, is placed onto foreigners, onto enemies, onto those who are different. And the difference is constructed, is exaggerated, is made to seem absolute when it is relative, is made to seem essential when it is superficial, is made to seem threatening when it is merely unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar is what the culture cannot tolerate, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge without threatening the narrative, without disturbing the reflection, without revealing that the mirror is distorting, is lying, is showing not reality but fantasy. And the fantasy is collective, is shared, is believed, not because evidence supports it, but because the culture requires it, requires the belief that we are good, are just, are noble, are superior. And the superior is the story that every empire tells, is the myth that every dominant culture maintains, is the narrative that justifies conquest, exploitation, domination. Because if we are superior, then we have the right to rule, have the obligation to civilize, have the duty to spread our ways to those who are inferior, who are backward, who are lacking what we have. And what we have is not just wealth or technology or power, but is virtue, is morality, is the right way of being human. And the right way is our way, is the only way, is the way that must be imposed on others for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our mirror shows, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not questioned internally, is not doubted by members, is accepted as truth, as obvious as the way things are. Because the culture has been internalized, has been absorbed, has become the framework through which reality is perceived, and perception is always filtered, is always shaped by the categories that culture provides, by the concepts that language offers, by the narratives that mythology supplies, and the supply is constant, is reinforced through education, through media, through the rituals that celebrate the culture, through the symbols that represent it, through the history that is taught. And the teaching is selective, is presenting only the parts that confirm the narrative, that support the myth, that maintain the reflection. And the reflection shows heroes, shows triumphs, shows progress, shows the culture moving toward perfection, toward the realization of its values, toward the fulfillment of its destiny. And the destiny is what the myth claims, is the belief that the culture is not just existing, but is going somewhere, is fulfilling a purpose, is playing a role in a larger story. And the story is always about us, is always centered on our experience, is always presenting our perspective as the perspective, our values as the values, our way as the way. And the way is not recognized as particular, but is experienced as universal, is not seen as one option among many, but is felt as the natural, the normal, the correct. And the correct is what blindness produces, is what the mirror creates, is the inability to see that the reflection is distorted, that the image is idealized, that the narrative is selective, and the selective is what creates the blind spots, is what prevents the culture from seeing its own violence, its own exploitation, its own contradictions, because these do not fit the narrative, do not confirm the myth, do not appear in the mirror, and so they are not seen, are not acknowledged, are not integrated into the culture's self-understanding, and the understanding remains partial, remains distorted, remains narcissistic, and the narcissism is not pathological in the individual sense, but is structural, is built into the way that cultures function, is necessary for cohesion, for identity, for the maintenance of boundaries. Because without the belief that we are special, the culture would dissolve, would fragment, would lose the binding force that makes a collection of individuals into a collective. And the collective requires mythology, requires shared stories, requires the mirror that reflects not individuals, but the group, not reality, but the ideal, not what is, but what is imagined, and the imagined is powerful, is shaping behavior, is creating expectations, is defining roles, is organizing life, and the organization is not neutral, is not innocent, is serving interests, is maintaining hierarchies, is justifying inequalities. Because the mythology always benefits some more than others, always privileges certain positions, always legitimates certain arrangements. And the legitimation is what the mirror provides, is what the myth accomplishes, is the conversion of contingent social arrangements into natural necessities of historical accidents, into inevitable developments of particular values, into universal truths. And the truths are not true, but are believed, are accepted, are acted upon. And the acting upon is what makes them real, in a sense, is what gives them power, is what makes them consequential. Because collective beliefs shape collective action, shape policy, shape war, shape empire. An empire is always justified through mythology, is always presenting itself as bringing civilization, bringing progress, bringing enlightenment to those who lack it. And the lack is projected, is assumed, is what the mirror does not show about the empire itself, which is that what it brings is often destruction, is exploitation, is the imposition of its ways onto others who did not ask for them, do not want them, are harmed by them, but the harm is not seen, is not reflected in the mirror, is not part of the narrative, because the narrative is about benevolence, about mission, about the burden that the superior must bear, and the burden is the story that Kipling told, is the myth that empires use, is the claim that domination is duty, that conquest is care. That exploitation is education, and the education is the transfer of culture, is the spreading of the superior ways, is the civilizing mission that justifies everything, that makes violence noble, that makes theft righteous, that makes subjugation liberation, and the liberation is what the empire claims to bring, is what its mythology proclaims, is what its mirror reflects, and the reflection is believed not just by rulers, but by the ruled, not just by exploiters, but by the exploited, because the mythology is totalizing, is pervasive, is shaping consciousness, is providing the categories through which experience is understood. An understanding within the mythology confirms the mythology, is circular, is self-reinforcing, is making it difficult to see outside, to recognize the distortion, to notice that the mirror is lying, and the lying is not intentional, is not conspiracy, is structural, is the way that collective narcissism operates, is the inevitable result of cultures needing to see themselves as good, as just, as right. And the right is always defined by the culture itself, is always reflecting back what the culture wants to see, is never showing what the culture is afraid to see, which is its own violence, its own hypocrisy, its own contingency. And the contingency is what every national myth denies, is what every claim to exceptionalism rejects, is the recognition that this culture could have been otherwise, that its values are not universal, but are particular, that its supremacy is not deserved, but is the result of power, of conquest, of accident. And the accident is what cannot be admitted, is what the mythology covers, is what the mirror hides, because admitting accident is admitting that the culture is not special, is not chosen, is not fulfilling destiny, but is just existing, just happening, just being one arrangement among many possible arrangements. And the many is what threatens, is what the other represents, is what must be denied in order to maintain the belief that we are the centre, are the standard, are the measure. And the measure is how cultures see others, is how they project onto difference. Everything they reject in themselves is how they create the barbarian, the savage, the backward, the enemy. And the enemy is necessary, is required by the mythology, is what defines the culture by contrast, is what makes us good by being bad, is what makes us civilized by being savage, is what makes us superior by being inferior. And the inferior is not discovered but is created, is constructed through the selection of differences, through the exaggeration of contrasts, through the interpretation of practices as evidence of backwardness. And the backwardness is what justifies intervention, justifies domination, justifies the spreading of our ways, because if they are backward, then they need us, need our help, need our civilization. And the civilization is what we bring, what we impose, what we force upon them for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our values dictate, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not listening, is not dialogue, is not exchange, is imposition, is violence, is the erasure of their culture in the name of bringing them ours. And the erasure is not seen as violence, but is seen as progress, is seen as liberation, is seen as the inevitable movement toward the universal, which is really the particular disguised as universal, is our particular values presented as the values, our particular ways presented as the way, our particular culture presented as culture itself. And culture itself is what we believe we are, is what the mirror shows, is what the mythology claims, that we are not just a culture, but our culture, are not just civilized, but our civilization, are not just one way of being human, but are the way, the correct way, the superior way. And the superiority is what cannot be questioned internally, is what is taboo to doubt, is what is defended violently when challenged. Because challenging the myth is challenging the culture's identity, is threatening the collective narcissism, is disturbing the mirror, and the mirror must be maintained, must be protected, must be polished, because without it the culture would have to see itself as it is, would have to confront its ordinariness, its violence, its contradictions. And the contradictions are everywhere, are visible to outsiders, are obvious to those who are not invested in the mythology, but are invisible to insiders, are not reflected in the mirror, are edited out of the narrative, are the blind spots that every culture has, that every mythology creates, that every collective narcissism requires, because seeing the contradictions would require changing, would require admitting error, would require acknowledging that the culture is not what it claims to be, is not as good as it believes, is not as just as it proclaims, and the proclaiming is constant, is part of the mythology, is the endless assertion that we are different, are better, are special, are the exception to the patterns that govern other cultures. And the exception is what every empire believes, is the myth of American exceptionalism, of British civilizing mission, of French universal values, of every dominant culture that has ever existed, each believing that it is different, that it is not like the empires that came before, that its domination is justified where others were not, that its violence is necessary where others was cruel, that its expansion is liberation where others was conquest. And the difference is illusion, is projection, is the mirror showing what the culture needs to see, which is that we are good, are noble, are doing what is right, and the right is whatever we are doing, is whatever serves our interests, is whatever maintains our power, and the power is presented as service, as burden, as duty, and the duty is what the mythology creates, is the belief that we must spread our ways, must bring our civilization, must impose our order, because without us the world would be chaos, would be darkness, would be backward, and the backward is where others are, is what defines them, is what justifies our dominance, and the dominance is not called dominance, but is called leadership, is called guidance, is called help. And the help is not asked for, is not wanted, is imposed, is forced, is the violence that the mirror does not show, that the mythology does not name, that the culture does not see, because seeing it would require shattering the mirror, would require abandoning the myth, would require confronting the collective narcissism. And the confronting is what cannot happen, is what is too threatening, is what would destroy the culture's sense of itself. And the sense of itself is what the culture is the only coherence it has, is the mythology that makes it a culture rather than just a collection of people. And so the mirror is maintained, the myth is preserved, the narcissism continues, and the culture sees itself as it needs to see itself, as special, as superior, as exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the distorted reflection that is mistaken for reality, is the mirror stage of culture where the culture is forever trapped, forever seeing the idealized image, forever believing the mythology, forever blind to the contradictions, forever projecting onto others what it cannot acknowledge in itself, forever creating the other who absorbs the negativity, who represents the threat, who justifies the violence, and the violence continues, the mythology persists, the mirror remains, and cultures continue to see themselves as the center, as the standard, as the exception, and the exception is the lie, is the delusion, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every mythology maintains, that every mirror reflects, and the reflecting is distorting, is hiding, is preventing the culture from seeing what it is, from acknowledging its contingency, from recognizing its violence, from confronting its contradictions, from shattering the mirror, from abandoning the myth, from giving up the narcissism. And the giving up is impossible, is what cultures cannot do, is what would mean their dissolution, their end, their transformation into something else. And the something else is what is feared, is what the mythology prevents, is what the mirror hides, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is the function, is what the distorted reflection accomplishes, is what makes cultures culture, is what allows collective identity, is what creates the binding force, and the force is mythology, is narrative, is the mirror that shows not truth, but need, not reality, but fantasy, not what is, but what must be believed. And the belief is collective, is shared, is the myth that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional. And the exceptional is the delusion, is the mirror stage of culture, is the permanent condition of collective consciousness, is the way that societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives. And the narratives are false, are projections, are narcissistic, and the narcissism is structural, is necessary, is what makes culture possible, is what creates cohesion, is what maintains the illusion that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure, and the measure is the mirror, is the myth, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every society maintains, that every empire believes, that every nation proclaims. And the proclaiming is the distortion, is the reflection, is the mirror stage where culture is trapped, where it sees itself not as it is, but as it needs to be, not as truth, but as mythology, not as one among many, but as the one, the exceptional, the special, the superior. And the superior is the lie, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs for itself, where it reflects its own image, where it sees only what it wants to see. And what it wants to see is that it matters, that it is right, that it is good. And the good is the reflection, is the myth, is the collective narcissism, is the mirror stage of culture where every culture is trapped, where every society remains, where every empire believes its own mythology, and the mythology is the mirror, is the distortion, is the way that cultures see themselves, as exceptional, as special, as superior. And the superior is the delusion, is the projection, is the narcissism, is the mirror stage that never ends, that continues forever, that defines culture, that creates the blind spots, that maintains the myth, that polishes the mirror, that reflects the lie. And the lie is believed, is shared, is what makes culture culture. And culture is the mirror, is the stage, is the collective narcissism, is the distorted reflection, is the mythology, is the illusion that we are exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the mirror stage of culture that shows not truth but need, not reality but fantasy, not what is but what must be seen. And the seeing is distorted, is narcissistic, is collective, is the way that cultures see themselves, forever, inevitably, necessarily, as the center, as the standard, as the exception. And the exception is the myth, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs, where it reflects, where it believes its own lies, and the lies are the culture, are the mythology, are the collective narcissism, are the mirror stage that every society inhabits, that every culture maintains, that every empire believes. And the believing is the distortion, is the reflection, is the way that cultures see themselves as exceptional when they are ordinary, as superior when they are equal, as chosen when they are contingent. And the contingent is what the mirror hides, is what the myth denies, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is permanent, is structural, is what makes the mirror stage of culture eternal, inevitable, universal. The way that all societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives that are believed, that are shared, that are maintained, that are the culture, that are the mirror, that are the stage, that are the collective narcissism that defines human social existence, that creates the blind spots, that justifies the violence, that maintains the myth, that every culture exhibits, that every society believes, that every empire proclaims. And the proclaiming is the mirror, is the stage, is the distorted reflection that is culture seeing itself. Consciousness all the way down. There is a view so strange, so counterintuitive, so apparently absurd that most philosophers dismiss it without argument. The view that consciousness is not something that emerges in complex biological systems, but is fundamental to reality itself, that electrons have experience, that atoms feel, that rocks possess some primitive form of awareness. And this view is called panpsychism, and it has been held by philosophers from the pre-Socratics through Leibniz and Spinoza, to contemporary thinkers who argue that panpsychism is not absurd but necessary, not a failure of reason, but the only solution to the hard problem of consciousness, the only way to explain how subjective experience arises in a physical universe. Because if consciousness is not fundamental, then it must emerge from non-conscious matter. An emergence of this kind seems impossible, seems like magic, seems to violate everything we know about how properties arise from components. And panpsychism avoids this problem by denying the premise, by insisting that consciousness does not emerge because it was there all along, present in some form at every level of reality. And if this seems crazy, it is only because we have inherited assumptions about matter being dead, inert, purely physical, in some narrow sense that excludes experience. But these assumptions are not forced on us by evidence, are not required by physics, are philosophical additions that might be wrong. That might be the source of the hard problem rather than constraints on its solution. The hard problem of consciousness, formulated most clearly by Chalmers, is the problem of explaining why there is something it is like to be a conscious organism, why physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective experience, by qualia, by the felt quality of seeing red or tasting coffee or feeling pain. And this is distinct from the easy problems, the problems of explaining how the brain processes information, how it responds to stimuli, how it controls behavior, because these are problems about function and mechanism, problems that neuroscience can address through standard scientific methods. But the hard problem is different, is about the existence of experience itself, about why the physical processes do not happen in the dark, why there is an inner life, a perspective, a what it is likeness, and no amount of information about neural firing patterns or computational processes seems to explain this, seems to bridge the gap between objective physical description and subjective felt experience. And this explanatory gap has led some philosophers to conclude that consciousness cannot be explained in physical terms, cannot be reduced to brain processes, cannot be naturalized, and this leads either to dualism, the view that consciousness is a separate substance that interacts with matter, or to panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter itself, present at every level, and panpsychism has seemed to many the less radical option, the one that preserves physicalism while acknowledging that physicalism must include consciousness, must expand our conception of what matter is rather than adding a separate mental substance. Nagel argued that the subjective character of experience is not captured by any functional or behavioral or physical description, that there is something it is like to be a bat that objective science cannot access, that the first-person perspective is irreducible to third-person description, and this does not force dualism, does not require that consciousness be non-physical, but it does require expanding what we mean by physical, recognizing that physics as currently formulated describes only the relational structure of matter, only how things interact and behave, only the extrinsic properties, and it leaves the intrinsic nature of matter unspecified, leaves open what matter is in itself apart from its relations. And this is where panpsychism enters, suggesting that the intrinsic nature of matter is experiential, that what it is like from the inside is consciousness or proto-consciousness, that the same entity can be described from the outside in terms of mass and charge and spin, and from the inside in terms of experience. And these are not two substances, but two aspects of one substance. And this is Russellian monism, the view that physics describes structure and consciousness describes the intrinsic nature that realizes that structure. And this makes consciousness fundamental without making it supernatural, integrates mind into nature without reducing it to mechanism, preserves the insights of both physicalism and the irreducibility of consciousness. But panpsychism faces a devastating objection: the combination problem, the problem of how. Micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences, how the consciousness of electrons and atoms and molecules adds up to the unified consciousness of a human being. Because combination seems impossible, seems to face the same kind of explanatory gap that emergence faces. Because if each particle has its own experience, how do those experiences combine into a single unified experience? Why is there one stream of consciousness associated with a brain rather than trillions of separate micro-consciousnesses? And saying they combine does not explain anything, does not tell us what combination means for consciousness, does not give us any idea of the mechanism or the principles that govern it. And this is the hardest problem for panpsychism, the place where the view seems to fail, seems to offer no advantage over emergence, because combination is just emergence under a different name, is just the same mystery relocated from the relationship between non-conscious matter and consciousness to the relationship between micro-consciousness and macro-consciousness. Goff and others have tried to solve the combination problem by distinguishing different senses of combination, by arguing that phenomenal combination is different from physical combination, that consciousness combines holistically rather than additively, that the right model is not addition where parts contribute independently, but something more organic, where parts are transformed by their relations to wholes, where the micro-experiences are modified by being part of a larger system in ways that create genuinely new experiences at the macro level. But critics argue this just pushes the problem back, just replaces the mystery of emergence with the mystery of holistic combination. And we still have no account of how it works. No principles that predict which combinations of micro-experiences produce which macro-experiences. No explanation of why human brains produce unified consciousness while rocks do not. And without such an account, panpsychism is just a label for the mystery rather than a solution to it. Coleman proposes that combination happens through overlapping wave functions in quantum mechanics, that when particles become entangled, their wave functions overlap, and their experiences blend into a unified experience. And this would give a physical mechanism for phenomenal combination, would explain how micro-experiences unite into macro-experiences through a well-understood physical process. But this proposal faces problems. Problems about whether entanglement really produces the right kind of unity. Problems about whether quantum mechanics applies at the level of neurons and brains, or only at the micro level. Problems about whether experiences can really blend the way wave functions superpose. And most philosophers remain unconvinced, remain skeptical that quantum mechanics solves the combination problem rather than just relocating it to a different domain. The boundary problem is related, the problem of where one conscious subject ends and another begins. Because if consciousness is present at every level, then why is there not one unified cosmic consciousness? Why are there separate subjects at all? Why does my consciousness end at the boundary of my body rather than extending to include everything? And panpsychism seems to have no principled answer, seems to allow for arbitrary boundaries, seems to make the existence of separate subjects as mysterious as the existence of consciousness itself. And this is another way the view fails to explain what it set out to explain. Another place where it encounters problems as hard as the ones it was meant to solve. Leibniz had a version of panpsychism. His monads were simple substances that had perception and appetition, that experienced the world from their own perspective, and he argued that complex beings were aggregates of monads, that each monad mirrored the entire universe from its own point of view. And this avoided the combination problem by denying real combination, by making each monad fundamentally separate, by explaining apparent interaction through pre-established harmony rather than causal connection. But this solution seems even more mysterious than the problem, seems to multiply entities and mechanisms beyond necessity, seems to replace one hard problem with many harder problems, and few contemporary panpsychists follow Leibniz down this path. Few are willing to accept the metaphysical extravagance his system requires. Strawson argues for panpsychism on the grounds that emergence is impossible, that you cannot get something from nothing, that if consciousness exists in the world, then it must have been present in the fundamental constituents of the world, must have been there from the beginning, because otherwise its appearance would be unintelligible, would be brute, would be the kind of emergence that violates the principle that effects must be contained somehow in their causes. And this argument has force, has intuitive appeal, captures the sense that consciousness is too radically different from non-conscious matter to emerge from it. But critics respond that emergence is ubiquitous in nature, that liquidity emerges from molecules that are not liquid, that life emerges from chemistry that is not alive, that many properties of wholes are not properties of parts. And if these emergences are possible, then why not consciousness? Why should consciousness be special? Why should it require fundamentality when other high-level properties do not? And Strawson's response is that consciousness is categorically different, that it is the only thing we know from the inside, that its emergence would not be like the emergence of liquidity, but like the emergence of existence itself. And this cannot emerge because emergence presupposes existence, And consciousness is a kind of existence, is the only kind we directly know, and so it must be fundamental. Tornoni's integrated information theory is sometimes interpreted as supporting panpsychism, because it says that consciousness is identical to integrated information, that any system with sufficient integration of information is conscious to some degree, and this would mean thermostats and atoms, and even individual electrons have tiny amounts of consciousness, have experience proportional to their integrated information, and this seems to support panpsychism, seems to make consciousness ubiquitous, but Tornoni himself resists the panpsychist interpretation, argues that most simple systems have essentially zero integrated information, that consciousness requires a specific kind of information integration that only complex systems like brains achieve. And the debate about whether IIT supports panpsychism turns on technical questions about how to measure integration, about what counts as information, about whether the theory is giving metaphysics or just correlation. And these questions remain unsettled, remain contested, remain another place where intuition and formalism diverge. The idea of proto-consciousness tries to soften panpsychism, tries to make it more palatable by saying that fundamental particles do not have full consciousness, but have some precursor of consciousness, some primitive form of experience that is to full consciousness, as charges to electromagnetism, a property that can give rise to consciousness without being consciousness itself. But this move seems to undermine the whole point of panpsychism, seems to reintroduce the emergence problem at a different level, because now we need to explain how proto-consciousness becomes consciousness, how the primitive forms combine and develop into the rich experiential life of humans. And this is just the hard problem again, just the explanatory gap relocated. And if proto-consciousness can do this, then why cannot non-consciousness do it? Why is proto-consciousness needed at all? And the answer seems to be that proto-consciousness makes emergence less mysterious, makes the gap smaller, but critics argue it just replaces one mystery with two: the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of proto-consciousness, and we are no better off than we started. James believed in a kind of panpsychism, believed in a pluralistic universe of experiences that combined and separated in various ways, believed that consciousness was not confined to brains, but was present wherever there was activity, wherever there was process, wherever there was something happening. And this fit his pragmatist philosophy, his rejection of rigid categories, his emphasis on process and relation over substance. But he never worked out the details, never solved the combination problem, never explained how his mind dust could aggregate into the unified streams of consciousness that characterize human experience. And his view remains more suggestive than systematic, more a gesture toward possibility than a worked-out theory. Whitehead developed an elaborate process philosophy where experience was fundamental, where actual occasions were drops of experience, where reality was constituted by moments of subjective feeling that perished and were superseded by new moments. And this was panpsychist in spirit. Though Whitehead resisted the label, and his system influenced many later philosophers, influenced process theology and ecological philosophy, and anyone who found substance metaphysics inadequate. But it also suffered from obscurity, from technical terminology that made it inaccessible, from a baroque complexity that seemed disproportionate to the problems. It solved, and while Whitehead's insights about process and relation and creativity remain valuable, his full system has few adherents, and his approach to consciousness has not solved the hard problem in ways that convince skeptics. The objection that panpsychism makes consciousness too cheap, too ubiquitous, too divorced from its connection to intelligence and behavior and biological function is answered by panpsychists who distinguish between consciousness and the various functional roles consciousness plays in humans, between bare experience and the kind of sophisticated, self-reflective awareness that humans have. And they argue that simple systems can have simple experiences without having thoughts or beliefs or desires or any of the cognitive machinery that humans possess. That consciousness comes in degrees, that there is a spectrum from the minimal experience of an electron to the rich inner life of a human. And this avoids making rocks intelligent while still allowing them some form of experience. But it also makes the view less testable, less empirical, less connected to anything we can observe or measure, because if consciousness is present everywhere, but only manifests in behavior in complex systems, then how do we know it is there in simple systems? How do we distinguish panpsychism from the claim that it is as if simple systems had experience, even though they do not? And this is the problem of panpsychist metaphysics. It makes claims that seem empirically empty, that make no difference to what we observe, that cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by evidence, and this makes many scientists dismiss the view as unscientific, as metaphysical speculation disconnected from empirical inquiry. Yet panpsychism refuses to die, keeps returning, keeps attracting new defenders, and this persistence suggests it is responding to something real, some genuine difficulty in explaining consciousness within a purely mechanistic framework, some intuition that consciousness is too fundamental, too irreducible, too different from everything else, to be just another emergent property like liquidity or temperature. And whether this intuition is trustworthy or misleading, whether it points toward truth or just reflects the limits of human imagination, remains one of the deepest, unresolved questions in philosophy of mind and panpsychism. Despite its problems, despite the combination problem and the boundary problem and all the other difficulties, remains a live option, remains a view that serious philosophers take seriously, remains a possibility that cannot be ruled out by current evidence or argument. And this says something about the state of consciousness studies, about how far we are from understanding what consciousness is, how it arises, why it exists, and whether we will ever have answers that satisfy both our scientific standards and our philosophical intuitions about what makes an explanation adequate. When believing everything means believing nothing, an author writes a book, spends years researching, checking facts, verifying claims, ensuring that every statement is as accurate as possible. And yet in the preface, the author writes something strange, writes that despite all efforts, there are surely errors somewhere in the book, that some claims are probably false, that the author believes there are mistakes, even though every individual claim was carefully checked and believed to be true when written. And this creates a paradox, because the author believes each individual claim in the book, believes claim 1 and claim 2 and claim 3 and so on, through hundreds of claims, but also believes that the conjunction of all these claims contains at least one falsehood, believes that not all of them are true together. And this seems irrational, seems like a contradiction, because if you believe P and you believe Q, then surely you should believe P and Q, surely belief should be closed under conjunction, surely rational agents should believe the logical consequences of what they believe. Yet the preface paradox shows a case where this principle fails, where following it would be irrational, where the reasonable stance is to believe each claim individually while denying their conjunction. And this has profound implications for epistemology, for theories of rational belief, for the question of whether knowledge requires certainty, for the relationship between fallibilism and rational consistency. The paradox was first formulated by Mackinson in the 1960s, though the underlying tension had been noticed earlier, and it arises from the combination of two plausible principles. First, that one can rationally believe each of a set of propositions while recognizing that the set probably contains errors. And second, that rational belief should be closed under conjunction should require that if you believe P and believe Q, then you believe P and Q, and these principles cannot both be true. At least one must be abandoned. And the question is, which one? And this is not merely technical, not merely a puzzle for logicians, but strikes at the heart of what it means to be rational. What constraints logic places on belief? Whether consistency is a requirement of rationality or merely an ideal that fallible beings cannot always achieve. The standard response is to deny closure, to say that belief is not closed under conjunction, that you can rationally believe P and believe Q without believing P and Q. And this seems counterintuitive, seems to violate basic logic, but the alternative seems worse, seems to require either that the author disbelieve some of the claims in the book, despite having good evidence for each, or that the author believe the conjunction, despite knowing it probably contains errors. And both of these options are clearly irrational, clearly violate norms of good reasoning. And so denying closure seems like the least bad option, seems like the way to preserve rationality in the face of the paradox. But it comes at a cost. The cost of admitting that rational agents can have beliefs that are logically inconsistent, that violate the most basic principles of logic. And this threatens the entire project of formal epistemology, the project of modelling rational belief using probability or logic or some other formal system. Because if belief does not obey logical constraints, then what does it obey? What makes belief rational, if not conformity to logical principles? Kuyberg's approach was to distinguish between belief and acceptance, between what one takes to be true for theoretical purposes and what one is willing to act on. And he argued that acceptance can violate closure, can be rationally inconsistent, can involve accepting P and accepting Q, while not accepting P and Q. Because acceptance is not about subjective confidence, but about practical reasoning, about what to assume for purposes of inquiry or action. And the preface shows that practical rationality sometimes requires accepting things that are logically inconsistent. And this is not irrationality, but recognition of fallibility, recognition that any complex set of beliefs probably contains errors even if we cannot identify which ones. And the rational response is not to pretend the beliefs are certain, but to acknowledge their fallibility while continuing to use them. And this means living with inconsistency, living with the knowledge that our belief system is flawed even as we rely on it. And this is the human epistemic condition, the condition of beings who must act on incomplete information, who must form beliefs that are individually well supported but collectively unreliable, who must navigate between the Scylla of skepticism and the Charybdis of overconfidence. The lottery paradox is closely related. Imagine a fair lottery with 1 million tickets, one will win, and you believe of each ticket that it will not win because the probability is only 1 in 1,000,000,000. And this seems rational, seems like you should believe of each ticket that it will lose. But if you believe this of each ticket, then by conjunction, you believe that no ticket will win. Yet you know that some ticket will win. And so your beliefs are inconsistent. You believe that ticket 1 will not win, and ticket 2 will not win, and so on for all 1,000,000 tickets. But you also believe that some ticket will win, and these cannot all be true. And this shows that high probability is not sufficient for rational belief, that you cannot simply believe everything that is highly probable, because doing so will lead to inconsistency. And this is another blow to probabilistic theories of belief. Another way that formal models fail to capture actual rational belief, because the model says you should believe everything above some probability threshold. But the lottery shows that this leads to contradiction, leads to believing things that logically cannot all be true. Foley argued that rationality does not require consistency, that it is possible for a rational person to have inconsistent beliefs, not because they are making a mistake, but because consistency is not always achievable, not always compatible with other rational goals, like believing what the evidence supports. And the preface paradox shows this, shows a case where the evidence supports each individual belief, but also supports the belief that the conjunction is false. And there is no way to make these beliefs consistent without abandoning some belief that the evidence supports. And so the rational thing is to live with the inconsistency, to acknowledge it, to be aware of it, but not to try to eliminate it by arbitrarily rejecting beliefs that are well supported, and this is a radical departure from traditional epistemology. Traditional epistemology assumed that consistency was a minimal requirement of rationality, that a rational agent had to have consistent beliefs. But Foley argues this is too demanding. This is an ideal that finite fallible creatures cannot always meet, and rationality requires doing the best we can with limited information and limited cognitive resources. And sometimes the best we can do involves having beliefs that are, strictly speaking, inconsistent. Harman distinguished between what he called content inconsistency and attitude inconsistency. Content inconsistency is when the contents of your beliefs cannot all be true together, like believing P and believing not P. While attitude inconsistency is when your attitudes do not fit together properly, like believing P while also suspending judgment about P. And he argued that attitude consistency is required for rationality, but content consistency is not. That you can rationally believe things whose contents are inconsistent as long as your attitudes toward them are appropriate, as long as you have the right degree of confidence, the right willingness to revise, the right acknowledgement of fallibility, and the preface case involves content inconsistency, but not attitude inconsistency. The author's attitudes are perfectly appropriate. The author believes each claim to the degree the evidence supports, believes the conjunction contains errors to the degree the evidence supports, and there is no attitude, confusion, no inappropriate confidence, no failure of rationality, only the inevitable content inconsistency that comes from being a fallible believer in a complex world. The connection to fallibilism is direct. Fallibilism is the view that knowledge does not require certainty, that one can know something while acknowledging the possibility of error. And if fallibilism is true, then one can know each claim in the book, while knowing that the book probably contains errors, can have knowledge that is individually solid but collectively flawed. And this means knowledge itself can be inconsistent, can involve knowing P and knowing Q and knowing not P and Q. And this seems deeply strange, seems to violate the principle that knowledge is factive, that if you know P, then P is true, because if you know P and know Q, then P and Q are both true, and so P and Q is true. And if you know P and Q is false, then you know something false which is impossible. And so the paradox reappears at the level of knowledge, not just belief. And the only escape is to deny that knowledge is closed under conjunction, to say that you can know P and know Q without knowing P and Q. And this has been called the most counterintuitive consequence of fallibilism. The idea that knowledge is not closed under obvious entailment, that you can know premises without knowing their logical consequences. That logic does not preserve knowledge in the way we thought it did. Williamson defends closure by denying that the author knows each individual claim, arguing that knowledge requires not just truth and justification, but safety, requires that the belief could not easily have been false, and in the preface case, many of the beliefs, though true and justified, could easily have been false. The author could easily have made mistakes, and so they do not count as knowledge. And this preserves closure at the cost of making knowledge very demanding, at the cost of saying that the careful author who double-checks everything still does not know most of what is in the book. And this seems wrong, seems to set the bar for knowledge too high, seems to imply that scientists do not know most of what they publish, that historians do not know the claims in their monographs, that fallible inquiry never produces knowledge. And if this is the cost of preserving closure, then maybe closure is not worth preserving. Maybe we should accept that knowledge is not closed, and that this is a feature, not a bug. A recognition that knowledge is a gradient, comes in degrees, is not an all or nothing status, but a matter of how well beliefs are supported and how carefully they have been checked. The problem connects to peer disagreement, because if an author believes all the claims in a book but also believes the book contains errors, and a peer believes all the same claims, then they agree on every individual claim, but disagree about whether the conjunction is true, or rather they both agree the conjunction is probably false, but cannot specify where the errors are. And this is a strange kind of agreement. Disagreement is consensus that there is error without consensus about what is erroneous, and this is the situation science often finds itself in. Scientists agree on individual results, but no. The overall body of accepted claims contains errors that will be corrected by future research. And this does not make science irrational, does not mean scientists should be less confident, does not mean they should reject any of the claims they currently accept. It just means they should be humble, should recognize fallibility, should maintain what Peirce called the scientific attitude, the attitude of permanent openness to revision, of treating all beliefs as provisional, of accepting that today's knowledge is tomorrow's error. And this attitude is not skepticism, not the denial that we know anything, but fallibilism, the recognition that what we know imperfectly, that our epistemic achievements are real but limited, that confidence and humility must coexist. Christensen argues that the preface paradox shows that rational belief is not belief in the ordinary sense, that what we should be modelling is not belief but credence, not all or nothing acceptance but degrees of confidence, and if we model belief as high credence, then the paradox dissolves, because you can have high credence in P and high credence in Q, while having lower credence in P and Q, you can assign 0.95 probability to each of 100 claims, while assigning low probability to their conjunction, because probabilities of conjunctions are products and products of many numbers, less than one are small. And this seems to solve the paradox, seems to show it was an artifact of treating belief as all or nothing. But it does not really solve it, because the preface author does not just have high credence in each claim. The author believes each claim, is willing to assert each claim, has written a book endorsing each claim. And this is not just high credence, but commitment, is not just 0.95 confidence, but the stance of taking something to be true. And this stance seems to require consistency, seems to be the kind of thing that should obey logical constraints. And the paradox shows that this intuition is wrong, that belief as commitment can be rationally inconsistent, that human cognition involves taking stances that do not add up logically, and this is not a failure but a necessity, a consequence of being the kind of creatures we are, creatures who must act decisively on uncertain information, who must commit to claims while acknowledging fallibility, who must hold inconsistent beliefs without becoming paralyzed by the inconsistency. The legal system faces this problem constantly. Juries are told to find defendants guilty only if guilt is proved beyond reasonable doubt, and they are told to consider each charge separately. And it is possible for a jury to rationally find a defendant guilty on charge 1, and guilty on charge 2, and guilty on charge 3, and guilty on charge 4, and guilty on charge 5, and guilty on charge 6, and guilty on charge 7, and guilty on charge 8, and guilty on charge 9, and guilty on charge 10, and guilty on charge 11, and guilty on charge 12, and guilty on charge 13, and guilty on charge 14, and guilty on charge 15, and guilty on charge 16, and guilty on charge 17, and guilty on charge 18, and guilty on charge 19, and guilty on charge 20, and guilty on charge 21, and guilty on charge 22, and guilty on charge 23, and guilty on charge 24, and guilty on charge 25, and guilty on charge 26, and guilty on charge 27, and guilty on charge 28, and guilty on charge 29, and guilty on charge 30, and guilty on charge 31, and guilty on charge 32, and guilty on charge 33, and guilty on charge 34, and guilty on charge 35, and guilty on charge 36, and guilty on charge 37, and guilty on charge 38, and guilty on charge 39, and guilty on charge 40, and guilty on charge 41, and guilty on charge 42, and guilty on charge 43, and guilty on charge 44, and guilty on charge 45, and guilty on charge 46, and guilty on charge 47, and guilty on charge 48, and guilty on charge 49, and guilty on charge 50, and guilty on charge 51, and guilty on charge 52, and guilty on charge 53, and guilty on charge 54, and guilty on charge 55, and guilty on charge 56, and guilty on charge 57, and guilty on charge 58, and guilty on charge 59, and guilty on charge 60, and guilty on charge 61, and guilty on charge 62, and guilty on charge 63, and guilty on charge 64, and guilty on charge 65, and guilty on charge 66, and guilty on charge 67, and guilty on charge 68, and guilty on charge 69, and guilty on charge 70, and guilty on charge 71, and guilty on charge 72, and guilty on charge 73, and guilty on charge 74, and guilty on charge 75, and guilty on charge 76, and guilty on charge 77, and guilty on charge 78, and guilty on charge 79, and guilty on charge 80, and guilty on charge 81, and guilty on charge 82, and guilty on charge 83, and guilty on charge 84, and guilty on charge 85, and guilty on charge 86, and guilty on charge 87, and guilty on charge 88, and guilty on charge 89, and guilty on charge 90, and guilty on charge 91, and guilty on charge 92, and guilty on charge 93, and guilty on charge 94, and guilty on charge 95, and guilty on charge 96, and guilty on charge 97, and guilty on charge 98, and guilty on charge 99, and guilty on charge 100, and guilty on charge 101, and guilty on charge 102, and guilty on charge 103, and guilty on charge 104, and guilty on charge 105, and guilty on charge 106, and guilty on charge 107, and guilty on charge 108, and guilty on charge 109, and guilty on charge 110, and guilty on charge 111, and guilty on charge 112, and guilty on charge 113, and guilty on charge 114, and guilty on charge 115, and guilty on charge 116, and guilty on charge 117, and guilty on charge 118, and guilty on charge 119, and guilty on charge 120, and guilty on charge 121, and guilty on charge 122, and guilty on charge 123, and guilty on charge 124, and guilty on charge 125, and guilty on charge 126, and guilty on charge 127, and guilty on charge 128, and guilty on charge 129, and guilty on charge 130, and guilty on charge 131, and guilty on charge 132, and guilty on charge 133, and guilty on charge 134, and guilty on charge 135, and guilty on charge 136, and guilty on charge 137, and guilty on charge 138, and guilty on charge 139, and guilty on charge 140, and guilty on charge 141, and guilty on charge 142, and guilty on charge 143, and guilty on charge 144, and guilty on charge 145, and guilty on charge 146, and guilty on charge 147, and guilty on charge 148, and guilty on charge 149, and guilty on charge 150, and guilty on charge 151, and guilty on charge 152, and 2, but not guilty of the conjunction if the conjunction requires proving additional facts beyond what is needed for the individual charges. And this is not. Irrational, not a failure of the jury, but reflects the structure of legal reasoning, reflects the difference between individual sufficient confidence and conjunctive sufficient confidence. And the law recognizes this by allowing separate verdicts on separate charges, by not requiring that verdicts on individual charges entail verdicts on conjunctions. And this is a practical recognition of what the preface paradox reveals theoretically, that consistency is not always achievable, that rational decision-making sometimes requires accepting things that logically conflict, that the demand for perfect consistency would paralyze action and judgment. The Buddhist concept of holding views lightly, of believing without clinging, of maintaining epistemic humility, resembles the attitude the preface paradox recommends, the attitude of believing each claim while believing one is probably wrong somewhere, of committing to specific positions while remaining open to error, of avoiding both dogmatism and relativism by taking stands while acknowledging their provisional nature. And this is not inconsistency in the sense of confused thinking, but inconsistency in the sense of recognizing that one's epistemic state does not and cannot achieve logical closure, that believing is always an ongoing process of revision rather than a finished state of certainty. And Western epistemology is slowly coming to acknowledge what Buddhist philosophy has long insisted, that the demand for certainty is the demand for something humans cannot achieve, that wisdom involves accepting uncertainty, that rationality is compatible with inconsistency when the inconsistency reflects fallibility rather than confusion. The preface paradox has no solution that everyone accepts, no way to dissolve it that does not involve rejecting some deeply held intuition about rationality or belief or logic. And this is characteristic of the deepest philosophical problems. They reveal tensions between principles we are reluctant to abandon. They force choices we are reluctant to make. They show that our concepts do not fit together as neatly as we assumed. And the preface paradox does all of this, forces us to choose between closure and fallibilism, between logical consistency and epistemic humility, between formal models of belief and actual believing. And whatever choice we make comes at a cost, comes with counterintuitive implications, comes with the recognition that rationality is more complex, more contextual, more human than formal epistemology imagined. And perhaps this is the real lesson of the paradox. Not that we need to solve it, but that we need to accept that it cannot be solved, that it reveals a permanent tension in human epistemic life, a tension between the demand for consistency and the reality of fallibility, and learning to live with that tension, learning to believe carefully while acknowledging error, learning to take stands while remaining humble is not a failure of rationality, but its highest achievement. The suffering is not in having little, but in having less, not in lacking, but in being surpassed, not in absence, but in comparison. And comparison is constant, is unavoidable, is built into perception, into cognition, into the social architecture of human life. Because humans are not isolated processes of absolute value, but are deeply embedded in networks where worth is relative, where position matters more than possession, where status is the thing being tracked, being measured, being fought over, and the fighting is exhausting, is endless, is producing anxiety that has no clear source except the presence of others, the visibility of their achievements, their possessions, their apparent happiness. And the apparent is what matters, is what comparison operates on. Because comparison does not have access to internal states, cannot measure actual satisfaction or genuine contentment, can only measure signals, displays, the external markers that are supposed to indicate success. And success is not absolute, is not a threshold that once crossed brings lasting peace, but is relative, is defined against the success of others, is meaningful only in context, only in relationship, only as position in a hierarchy that has no natural endpoints, no place where more is impossible, no level where comparison stops. And the stopping is what never happens, is what cannot happen, because there is always someone higher, always someone with more, always someone whose position makes one's own position feel insufficient, feel like failure, feel like falling behind. And behind is where comparison places everyone, except the very top, except the singular position that by definition only one can occupy. And even that position is temporary, is unstable, is vulnerable to being surpassed, to losing the lead, to falling back into the mass of strivers who are all measuring themselves against the same unreachable standard. And the unreachable is what drives the system, is what keeps everyone running, keeps everyone comparing, keeps everyone suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others, where they imagine others, where the displays and signals suggest others have arrived, and the arrival is illusion, is performance, is the curated presentation that social media perfects, that makes comparison more toxic than ever before. Because the comparison is now constant, is now unavoidable, is now the default activity of any moment with a screen. And the screen shows the highlight reel, shows the best moments, the peak experiences, the carefully selected and filtered images that are meant to represent lives, but are really representing brands, representing the performance of success. And the performance is what gets compared against reality, against the unfiltered experience of one's own life, with all its ordinariness, all its mundane moments, all the time that is not photogenic, not shareable, not worth displaying. And the asymmetry creates distortion, creates the sense that everyone else is doing better, is happier, is more successful, is living the life that one should be living, but is not. And the not is experienced as personal failure, as inadequacy, as evidence that something is wrong with the self, when really what is wrong is the comparison, is the measuring of internal experience against external display, of reality against performance, of the whole of one's life against the curated fragments of others' lives. And the fragments are not representative, are not honest, are not revealing the struggles, the doubts, the failures that are also present but are edited out, are kept private, are not part of the display. And so the display creates impossible standards, creates the sense that success should be constant, that happiness should be visible, that worth should be demonstrable. And demonstrable means comparable, means measurable against others, means existing in the public space where position can be assessed, where rank can be assigned, where the hierarchy becomes visible. And the visibility is what social media provides, is what makes the panopticon complete, is what ensures that everyone is always being watched, always being measured, always being compared, not by a central authority, but by everyone else, by the distributed surveillance of the network, where every post is a signal, every image is a claim, every update is a statement of position, and the position is what matters, is what gets evaluated, is what determines worth in the social economy, where attention is currency and visibility is power, and power is zero-sum, is rivalrous, is gained by some at the expense of others, because attention is finite, is limited, is allocated according to comparison, according to who is most interesting, most successful, most worth watching. And the worth watching is what everyone is competing for, is what drives the performance, is what makes authenticity impossible. Because authenticity does not optimize for attention, does not maximize engagement, does not win the comparison, and winning is what the system demands, is what the architecture incentivizes, is what the algorithms reward, and the rewards go to those who perform best, who display most effectively, who signal status most clearly, and the clarity is achieved through excess, through conspicuous consumption, through the demonstration of resources, of connections, of experiences that others do not have. And the not having is what makes the display valuable, is what makes it worth envying, is what triggers the comparison that produces the anxiety that drives more performance, more display, more competition. And the competition is the prison, is the trap, is the system that has no exit, because exiting means becoming invisible, means losing position, means falling behind. And behind is unbearable, is the failure state, is where the losers are. And no one wants to be a loser. No one wants to be the one who is surpassed, who is left behind, who is forgotten. And the forgetting is what happens to those who stop performing, who stop displaying, who drop out of the comparison. And dropping out is not freedom but is erasure, is not peace but is irrelevance, is not escape but is defeat. And so most stay in, most keep performing, most keep comparing, most keep suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others. And the seeing is continuous, is unavoidable, is the default state of consciousness. In an environment where everyone's position is visible, where everyone's success is displayed, where everyone's life is performance, and the performance is what gets internalized, becomes the standard against which the self is measured. And the measuring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every context, whenever others are present, or even when they are not present but are represented, are visible through screens, through feeds, through the endless stream of signals that constitute social media. And social media is the panopticon perfected, is the prison where everyone is guard and prisoner simultaneously, is watching and being watched, is judging and being judged, is comparing and being compared. And the comparing is the punishment, is the suffering, is the anxiety that has no clear cause except the presence of others, the visibility of their position, the evidence that they have what one does not have, and the not having is experienced as deprivation, as relative deprivation, as the sense that one is lacking not in absolute terms but in comparison to others, and the comparison is the only terms that matter, is the only measurement that counts. Because humans are social, are tribal, are wired to care about position, about rank, about where they stand in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is not natural, is not fixed, is not based on any inherent quality, but is constructed through comparison, through the constant evaluation of signals, of displays, of the markers that are supposed to indicate worth. And worth is not intrinsic, is not internal, is not a property of the self, but is assigned, is determined by others, is the result of comparison, of measurement, of the social process that ranks everyone according to criteria that are arbitrary, that are culturally specific, that are manipulable. And the manipulation is what social media enables, is what allows anyone to perform success, to display status, to signal position regardless of underlying reality. And the reality is hidden, is private, is not part of the comparison. And so the comparison is always distorted, is always measuring performance against performance, display against display, rather than reality against reality. And the reality is that most people are struggling, are anxious, are feeling inadequate, are suffering from the same comparison that they are inflicting on others, and the inflicting is not intentional, is not malicious, is just participation, is just performing, is just displaying the signals that are required to maintain position, to avoid falling behind, to stay in the game. And the game is the prison, is the system that has no winners, because there is no end point, no level of success that brings peace, no amount of status that ends comparison, because comparison is relative, is always finding someone higher, always finding new metrics, always raising the bar, and the raising is what makes enough impossible, is what ensures that satisfaction is temporary, is what converts every achievement into baseline, into the new normal that is no longer impressive, no longer enviable, no, longer worth displaying because everyone else has caught up, has matched the signal, has equaled the performance, and so new signals are needed, new displays are required, new forms of status must be pursued, and the pursuit is endless, is exhausting, is producing the anxiety that characterizes modern life, the sense that one is always falling behind, always insufficient, always failing to measure up. And the measuring up is the problem, is the trap, is the prison, because up is infinite, is unlimited, is always higher than wherever one currently is. And so the climbing never ends, never reaches a summit, never arrives at a place where comparison stops, where enough is recognized as enough, where peace is possible, and peace is not possible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position always matters, is wired into human psychology, is part of the social brain that evolved to track status, to monitor hierarchy, to care intensely about where one stands relative to others, and the relative is the only measure that counts, is the only information that the social brain processes, is why absolute improvements in living standards do not produce corresponding improvements in happiness. Because happiness is relative, is determined by comparison, is about position not possession, and position is zero-sum, is gained by some at the expense of others, is the ranking that ensures most people feel inadequate most of the time. Because most people are not at the top, are not in the elite positions, are somewhere in the middle or the bottom, are below someone, are being surpassed by someone, are losing the comparison to someone, and the someone is always visible, is always present, is always there to trigger the anxiety, to produce the envy, to create the suffering that comes from measuring oneself against others and finding oneself lacking. And the lacking is not real, is not objective, is only relative, is only meaningful in comparison. But the comparison is what makes it feel real, what makes it feel like failure, what makes it feel like something is wrong, something needs to change, something must be improved. And the improvement is pursued, is worked toward, is achieved. And the achievement brings temporary satisfaction, brings a brief moment of feeling successful, of feeling adequate, of feeling like enough. But the enough is temporary, is quickly replaced by new comparison, by new awareness of those who are higher, who have more, who have surpassed. And the surpassing is the trigger, is what resets the baseline, is what converts achievement into inadequacy, is what makes the prison inescapable. Because escaping requires not just achieving more, but achieving more than everyone else. And everyone else is also striving, is also comparing, is also trying to escape through achievement. And so the competition intensifies, the standards rise, the bar keeps moving, and the moving is what makes peace impossible, makes satisfaction temporary, makes enough unattainable, because enough is not an absolute measure, but is relative, is defined by comparison, is determined by position, and position is always vulnerable, is always threatened, is always at risk of being lost. And the risk creates anxiety, creates vigilance, creates the constant monitoring of others, of their signals, of their displays, of any evidence that they're gaining, advancing, surpassing, and the surpassing is what must be prevented, is what drives the performance, is what makes rest impossible, makes dropping out unthinkable, makes the prison unescapable, except by those rare individuals who somehow break free of comparison, who somehow stop measuring themselves against others, who somehow find peace in their own position, regardless of where that position is in the hierarchy. And these individuals are rare, are exceptions, are not the norm, because the norm is comparison, is the constant measurement, is the anxiety that comes from always being aware of others, of their position, of their apparent success, and the apparent is what matters, is what the social brain responds to, is what triggers the envy. And envy is information, is the signal that someone else has something valuable, something worth having, something that could improve one's own position. And the position is what envy is tracking, is what it is designed to make salient, is the gap that needs closing, and the closing is pursued through imitation, through acquisition, through the striving to match what the envied other has, to equal their position, to eliminate the gap. But the gap never closes, is never eliminated, because as soon as one gap is closed, another opens. As soon as one person is matched, another surpasses. As soon as one goal is achieved, the goalposts move, and the moving is what makes the prison permanent, makes the suffering chronic, makes the anxiety inescapable, because the architecture of social comparison is not designed for peace, is not optimized for satisfaction, is designed for striving, for competition, for the endless pursuit of position. And the pursuit is the function, is what the system needs, is what makes the hierarchy dynamic, what keeps people climbing, what ensures that those at the top are always being challenged, always being pursued, always at risk of being overtaken. And the risk is what makes their position valuable, is what makes status worth having, is what creates the scarcity that makes position meaningful. And meaningful means enviable, means desirable, means worth suffering for. And the suffering is universal, is experienced at every level, is not limited to those at the bottom, but is felt even at the top. Because even at the top there is comparison. There is the awareness of others who are close, who are threatening, who might surpass, and the might creates anxiety, creates the need to defend position, to maintain distance, to keep performing, keep displaying, keep signalling status. And the signalling is exhausting, is requiring constant effort, constant vigilance, constant awareness of how one is being perceived, how one is being measured, how one's position is being evaluated by others who are always comparing, always measuring, always judging. And the judging is mutual, is reciprocal, is everyone evaluating everyone else, is the distributed surveillance that makes the panopticon total, that makes escape impossible, that ensures everyone is always in the prison, always being compared, always suffering from the awareness that others are watching, measuring, judging, and that the judgment might be negative, might find one lacking, might assign a lower position than one wants, than one deserves, than one has worked for. And the work is never enough, is never sufficient, is never achieving the permanent security that would allow rest, would allow peace, would allow the comparison to stop mattering. Because the comparison never stops mattering, is always relevant, is always the measure that counts, is what determines worth in the social economy, where position is everything, where rank is identity, where hierarchy is reality, and reality is constructed through comparison, through the constant measurement that assigns everyone a place, a position, a rank. And the rank is always provisional, always temporary, always vulnerable to change, to being surpassed, to falling. And the falling is what everyone fears, is what drives the anxiety, is what makes the prison work. Because the prison is not a place, but is a process, is the constant comparison that measures everyone against everyone else and finds everyone lacking. Because lacking is relative, is inevitable, is the necessary result of a system where only one can be first, where most must be middle, where someone must be last, and the last is where no one wants to be, is the position that is avoided, that is fled from, that creates the most anxiety, the most suffering, the most desperate striving to escape. And the escape is pursued through the same means that created the prison, through comparison, through performance, through display, through the signalling of status that is supposed to improve position, but only reinforces the system, only strengthens the prison, only ensures that comparison continues, that measurement persists, that the anxiety remains. And the remaining is permanent, is chronic, is the condition of social existence in an environment where everyone is visible, where position is trackable, where comparison is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes the suffering universal, is what ensures that peace is rare, that satisfaction is temporary, that enough is never enough, because enough is not absolute but is relative, is determined by comparison, is defined by position, and position is always being measured, always being evaluated, always being compared, and the comparison is the prison, is the trap, is the source of suffering that has no solution except the impossible one of stopping comparison, of ceasing to measure oneself against others, of finding worth that is internal rather than relative, that is intrinsic rather than assigned, that is independent of position, independent of rank, independent of the hierarchy that comparison creates and maintains, and the maintenance is collective. Is everyone participating? Everyone contributing? Everyone reinforcing the system by comparing, by displaying, by performing, by caring about position? And the caring is what makes the prison work, is what keeps everyone trapped, is what ensures that suffering continues, that anxiety persists, that peace remains impossible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position will always matter, will always be salient, will always be the measure that counts. Because humans are social, are hierarchical, are wired to care about rank, about status, about where they stand relative to others, and the relative is the only measurement that has ever mattered, is the only comparison that counts, is the prison that has no walls but is inescapable, is the trap that has no lock but cannot be opened, is the suffering that has no cause except comparison, except the presence of others, except the visibility of their position. And the position is always visible, is always present, is always there to measure against, to fall short of, to suffer from the awareness that someone is higher, someone has more, someone is better, and the better is what one is not, is what one is lacking, is what the comparison reveals, and the revealing is the suffering, is the prison, is the condition that cannot be escaped as long as comparison continues, and comparison will continue, must continue, is built into the architecture of social existence, is the foundation of the hierarchy, is the mechanism that assigns position. And position is everything, is worth, is identity, is the measure of the self, and the self is always being measured, always being compared, always being found insufficient. And the insufficient is the prison, is the trap, is the suffering that is universal, that is inescapable, that is the cost of being social, of being visible, of being in comparison with others. And the comparison is the prison, and the prison is where everyone lives, where everyone suffers, where peace is impossible and enough is never enough.